The Battle of Midway was the turning point for both the US and Japan in World War II. A huge chunk of Japanese carrier capability was lost there, and from then on, Japan was mostly on the defensive. But imagine the most modern Japanese destroyer of today time traveling to 1942, joining the Japanese fleet, and replacing their biggest aircraft carrier in the fleet. Would such a switch impact the outcome of the Midway battle? Can one ship make so much difference? The destroyer can give Japan access to high-tech, but there's also a race to high-tech in Call of War sponsoring this video. It's a free online strategy game where you choose one of up to 100 real countries and play against other human players in real time. There's honestly no limit to what you can achieve in a game. I love it that I can start with a small country, and if my strategy and diplomacy prove right, I can rule the whole of Europe or even the world. Call of War can be played with the same account on both PC and mobile, and the game is giving new bank of players a gift. If you click on the link in the description below and make a new account, you'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is available for 30 days only, so try it out now. Back to our video. The newest, biggest and most capable destroyer in today's Japanese Navy is the JS Haguro of the Maya class. The ship is based on previous similar classes of destroyers like Atago and Kongo, which in turn were based on the US Burke-class destroyers. The design, however, got enlarged over time. Haguro's main system is its Aegis weapon system. It couples various sensors, such as modern radars, with various modern anti-aircraft missiles, as well as other weaponry. Today's main role of the ship is one of air defense, but in 1942 that might change. The ship has 96 vertical launch cells for various anti-air missiles, as well as 8 dedicated anti-ship missiles, in addition to guns and torpedoes. Finally, a single helicopter hangar is present on the ship, made to house a single Seahawk helicopter. Said destroyer, fully stacked, finds itself whisked to the very start of June 1942. In this fantastical event, however, Japan's carrier Kaga also disappears. Probably sent to 2023, who knows. In the real timeline, Kaga was one of the 4 fleet carriers Japan used in the Battle of Midway, and being the largest, it actually held more than 1/4 of the total number of planes between those fleet carriers. In effect, that loss of Kaga would cost the Japanese fleet 25% of its fighters and 29% of its bombers. That's important to stress because Japan had several force groups spread around for the whole campaign, but only 2, the first fleet containing the fleet carriers and the second fleet, tasked with invading Midway Atoll itself, were close enough to really be useful in this time-traveling thought experiment. One of the strongest US weapons for the Battle of Midway was the fact that the US had broken Japanese communication codes. The US knew more or less the very day of the attack. It knew the general locations and dispositions of Japanese task forces, so the US decided to set up an ambush with its carriers. At the very end of May, as their fleets were already en route, the Japanese had started using a new code, so the US had little fresh info to go on with, but by then the pieces were already in play. Except, of course, for the time-traveling switch. The US will not know about it. As usual with our time-traveling scenarios, we'll have to hand-wave the psychological effects of such an event. Both the 1942 and 2023 Japanese crews don't consider it strange and simply proceed to work together. Because, let's face it, otherwise the scenario would not work as intended. The thing is, modern Japanese sailors would, as usual in these scenarios, also lose knowledge of history, because it's no fun when one side knows the future. But they would still very much present the capabilities of their ship to the command. For the sake of the scenario, let's say the command would blindly trust the time travelers and still decide to go on with the attack. Japan's new addition would thus have 3 or so days to talk to the rest of the fleet. They would likely send people over and devise a new plan. Such communication would be fairly safe, even if somehow intercepted, as the US had not yet broken the new code at the start of June. But the new destroyer's most potent weapon would not be missiles. It would not even be its radars, though those are very potent. It would be its single lone helicopter. Now, the helicopter in itself is not necessarily worth much. Both the US and Japan were using plenty of scout planes, trying to scout the seas and trying to spot the enemy fleets from great distances. Of course, back then, that was done using eyesight and binoculars. A fleet could be spotted, depending on conditions and size, at the distance of a 20 to at best 30 nautical miles. But weather and spotters' concentration and training would often lower those figures. The US was trying to do that in the real timeline, using scout planes. But the sea is vast, so it was still a very hard task. In the end, the US did not spot Japan's main carrier fleet first. They had spotted the invasion fleet and mistook it for the carrier fleet. In this alternate universe scenario, however, the air defense destroyer could make quick work of any scouting plane getting too close. It might even let some live on purpose, to conserve missiles and not risk giving away the carrier's fleet position. But if a high-flying plane would come to less than 60 miles or so of the fleet, it's likely an anti-air missile would be launched. The scout plane would not sense enemy radar or incoming missiles. They would likely not even get to try to evade. So those planes would get shot down with a missile efficiency of over 90%. Now, even though the Haguro has 96 VLS cells, not all would be filled out with useful stuff. That's because this time-traveling event was not prepared, so the usual loadout in those cells would look something like this. Mind you, the newest SM-6 missile, which Japan has bought, has not yet been delivered. Oh, and the ESSM missiles can be quad-packed in each cell, explaining why there are more than 96 missiles in total. Meaning a quarter of the missiles might be nearly useless. Some would be anti-submarine missiles. Sure, the US did have a dozen submarines in the general area, but those did not have a meaningful effect on the battle. The SM-3 anti-ballistic missiles would be even less relevant. Those are designed to deploy their final stages and seek targets in outer space only. Their steering within the atmosphere is very limited. But the SM-2 missiles, designed for long-range plane interception, would make quick work of any World War II aircraft. Aegis radars could likely differentiate between some plane types. They could certainly tell apart a 4-engine bomber from a 2-engine plane, and from a single-engine one. So missiles might be spent on only the most dangerous threats. But let us get back to that helicopter. As the Japanese fleet starts approaching the atoll, its helicopter would start going up more frequently. It would fly in specific patterns in front of the fleet, some 100 to 200 nautical miles out from the fleet. But it wouldn't be using eyeballs. Rather, it would use a high-resolution surface search radar. Depending on the cruise altitude, its radar would be able to both find and identify contacts out to 160 nautical miles, at night or bad weather if needed. Coupled with the helicopter's range, Japan would be able to find US ships some 300 nautical miles away from its fleet. That's more or less the distance between actual US and Japanese carriers of the real timeline in the early evening on June 3rd, roughly 12 hours before the actual Battle of Midway started. So depending on where exactly the helicopter is at that point, because it could be refueling, it's plausible that by midnight the Japanese would have fairly good radar images of the US Task Force 17, complete with its USS Yorktown carrier. The other US Task Force with 2 remaining carriers sailed a few dozen miles to the east. Those 2 would likely be spotted as well, within several hours at most, during nighttime. It would be very early morning of June 4th. Remember, this would all happen before the first strike on Midway Atoll was performed in the actual timeline, so the Japanese plans would change further. They would redirect their fleet towards the biggest threat, the US carriers. The distance by then would likely be around 200 nautical miles, perhaps even less. The actual launch of Japanese aircraft will likely wait for dawn. In the meantime, the helicopter would do shorter missions just to make sure the US fleet is still there, and would crucially be observing the US fleet at dawn, because the destroyer would join in, performing the first strike. Haguro carries 8 anti-ship missiles. Those are Type 17 missiles, the newest such missiles in the Japanese inventory. They are successors to the Type 90 and Type 12 missiles and feature a doubled range. Now, 8 such missiles are enough to cause some destruction, but are not enough to obliterate the fleet. Exact weight figures for the Type 17 are unknown, but it's plausible they don't steer too far from its predecessors. Using coordinates supplied by the helicopter, those missiles would fly towards their targets until their onboard radars would take over. Given that World War II carriers had waterline belt armor against torpedoes, it's plausible the missile's attack profile would be a top-down one. Said warhead would be able to do a lot of damage. Bombs used against carriers at Midway were generally of similar weight as the missile, but with roughly double the amount of explosive filler. Still, even some 500-pound bombs had managed to seriously damage a carrier in the real timeline. It is possible that a single missile hit to the deck could pretty much shut down aircraft operations for a few hours. Given that all 3 US carriers would be targeted, the Japanese force would initially strike with 2 missiles per carrier, leaving 2 missiles for possible later usage after initial damage is assessed. Not knowing of the concept of such a missile, it's likely not a single one would be identified as a threat and intercepted. Out of 3 carriers, it's likely at least 1 and possibly all 3 would be damaged enough that air ops would cease, with some possibly being engulfed by a fire threatening the whole ship. Due to nighttime preceding the attack and the damage, it's unlikely the US fleet would have or be able to upkeep more than a dozen or 2 fighters in the air. And then the Japanese aircraft would come, timed so the US carriers would not have time to repair DAG damage. They would also be directed by the helicopter observer, though the helicopter would likely be on its last legs fuel-wise by then. Sending large attack waves made of half of Japanese fighters and 3/4 of bombers, the Japanese would likely succeed in causing significant further damage to US carriers. Japan might lose several dozen planes while doing it, but it would be a small price to pay, relatively speaking. In those early hours of June 4th, 1942, it's likely all 3 US carriers would be burning, each hit by multiple half-ton bombs, and some possibly by torpedoes. It's likely at least 1, if not more, would be sinking outright. The US fleet would of course alert Midway as soon as the destroyer's missile struck. It would know Japan's fleet is close, so all those scout planes would get scrambled and focus on the surroundings. They would either spot Japan's fleet outright, or enough of them would be shot down by the destroyer in a small area, enough for a rough geolocation of the threat. While the carriers are out of the picture, the US did have a sizable fleet of aircraft on the nearby Midway atoll itself. In this timeline, it might be slightly farther away from the Japanese fleet, but still attainable at some 100 or 200 miles away. In the real timeline, the Japanese first struck at those land-based aircraft. After the strike, some 70 US planes were destroyed or inoperable. But in this timeline, focusing on the carriers, the Japanese would be faced with a greater threat from the atoll itself. Large bombers would not be much of a threat to Japan. Those were used and missed in the actual timeline as well. And here some might be intercepted by the destroyer's missiles. But if most of the 40 tactical bombers could be mustered, protected by 24 fighters, then the US might have a somewhat potent force against Japan's remaining fighters. Haguro's Aegis radar would spot incoming US planes, probably giving little over 1 hour warning time. It's very unlikely the Japanese planes returning from their initial strike on US carriers would be able to get back into the air in time to beef up Japan's numbers. But the Japanese would likely get most of their remaining fighters up in time for an interception. The destroyer might use some of its long-range missiles to thin out the US numbers, but it would have to conserve its missiles. An air battle would likely ensue. It's plausible some of the US bombers would get through, as they would outnumber the Japanese 2 or 3 to 1. But as soon as they would start their bomb or torpedo runs, the destroyer would launch ESSM missiles at them. SM-2 missiles might also be used for terminal interceptions, if enough would be left. A few dozen planes might be hit before they would release their payload. In the end, with US fighters keeping Japanese fighters busy, the US might be able to strike with half a dozen remaining tactical bombers. The destroyer does have 2 phalanx close-in weapon systems, which could intercept bombs, but it's likely the ship would not be close enough to all Japanese carriers to protect them all in such a way. As most of the US bombers would be dive bombers, those would still pose a threat, but only hits on 1 Japanese carrier would be plausible with such numbers, before US planes expended their ordnance. Japanese carriers were generally less damage resistant than US ones, so it's plausible even 1 or 2 bomb hits might render it inoperable. A real timeline saw all 4 carriers sunk. Combat would then subside for a few hours. The Japanese would try to repair damage. The US would essentially be out of planes. The Japanese helicopter would likely get sent into another scouting mission, trying to ascertain the damage on the US fleet. Japan would also likely send its aircraft on one more small recon and strike mission, while trying to preserve at least a dozen fighters to protect its fleet. Given the 2 more anti-ship missiles left and that subsequent strike, it's likely all 3 US carriers would eventually be sunk or turned into floating hulks. Some US cruisers might suffer as well. Protecting its carriers, the US had only cruisers and destroyers. The combined Japanese invasion and carrier fleet, besides the remaining carriers, had many more ships, including 7 battleships. Trying to stick around and use US ships to protect Midway would likely end with the entire US fleet sunk, so the fleet would likely retreat due to grave danger. Most US submarines on patrol would likely not get the message to return home in time, and the torpedo boat squadron could do little. Now, it's quite possible that the US would simply accept there's little they can do to protect Midway at that point. If nothing else would be attempted, the Japanese forces would get to actually invade the atoll. Besides luring in US carriers, that was the other main goal of their force. For it, Japan had transport ships housing 5,000 troops. On Midway Atoll, the US had some 4,000 personnel, but while the Japanese figure represents well-trained combat troops, the US one includes various naval and air crews, servicing planes and lacking heavy weapons. Japan would likely do a few more strike waves against the atoll, making sure all the remaining US planes are neutralized, and that might take another day. Ample shore bombardment by battleships and cruisers would be a given too, and eventually the amphibious assault would be performed. Given the very small area of the atoll, it's likely US forces would have very little way of finding protection during a prolonged bombardment. The islands are also quite flat and were devoid of complex networks of caves and bunkers, so the US troops would likely not hold out as well as the Japanese did at Okinawa or Iwo Jima. It's likely that eventually the Japanese forces would disembark and manage to subdue whatever defenders would be left standing. Some US submarines might try to attack the Japanese fleet and might even sink some of the picket destroyers. Pearl Harbor is some 1,300 miles away, so actual assistance from its aircraft would be almost non-existent, right? Well, sensibly, yes, but the US could attempt one last Hail Mary move. It could try to send masses of planes from Oahu, lightly armed, on a one-way mission. Those would barely have enough fuel to do a short bit of fighting before having to either land on Midway or simply ditch into the sea. Exact figures of planes on Oahu aren't known, but they should be at least half of the figures shown. Of those shown, the P-38 fighters and the bombers would have enough range for such a stunt. Given that the decision for the reinforcements might be made already by midday on June 4th, and that Japan would need time to carefully approach Midway to bombard it, it's plausible the first US aircraft reinforcements might reach it before the end of June 4th. It's not likely Japan would be able to upkeep more than a few fighters over the airfield on rotation. Still, bomb strikes might have decimated the infrastructure, and US reinforcements might be out of fuel. And the Japanese might then rush ahead with their battleships and cruisers, suffering further losses until they manage to shut the entire atoll down. At best for the US, providing enough important infrastructure to survive Japanese strikes, the US planes might refuel and lift again into the air, and the Japanese might be too careful to do a battleship rush. All those planes might be enough to hold the island defenses for another day. The destroyer would by then be out of air defense missiles, but its potent radar could still be used to direct Japanese air formations. If such an outcome proves possible, the US would be sure to quickly keep sending more and more planes. Not just combat ones, but transport planes, trying to beef up the number of defending troops. So, at best for Japan, it would be able to both defeat the US Pacific Carrier Force and take the Midway Islands. At worst, Japan would miss out on taking Midway, but it would still have sunk those US carriers, while suffering fairly small losses. Either way, Japanese would likely win the Battle of Midway, enabled by modern technology, primarily radar. Of course, one battle would hardly win the whole war for Japan. The US would likely turn Hawaii Islands into fortresses, stocking them up with hundreds of planes. If it takes Midway, Japan's force there would still have the edge of radar, but would otherwise be quite spent and vulnerable. The huge Japanese fleet would have to go back for resupplies. Who knows what would happen with Midway itself then? And depending on usage, the helicopter would eventually run out of spare parts and cease operating, or the US would eventually figure out what they have to look for and would eventually hunt it down. But even if helicopters' turbines managed to use some concocted Japanese fuel, and even if Japanese decided to use the destroyer as their main ship, their fleet would sooner or later get overwhelmed by the masses of US carriers and aircraft. The destroyer might buy Japan another year in the war, but the ultimate course of the war would not be changed. Allow us a few more words about Call of War. There are various maps to play: the European theater, the Pacific one, the US homefront, and only if you can handle it, the entire world map. Matches are methodical and can last for weeks. Call of War is no clickfest. You manage regions and whole countries, steer economy, trade resources, or research over 120 different units. Just look at all these units at hand. Buildings and units in-game are historically accurate models. And yes, you can even nuke your opponents, though I'd advise nurturing the right alliances more. There are regular updates to the game and free new content. Premium content is optional, but Call of War gives new Binkov players just that. Use the link in the description below and you'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free.